All right, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of the Campus Mental Health Echo here for March. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Thank you to everyone who's been putting their information into the chat. If you just hopped on, go ahead and do that while we get started. We're going to have a presentation by Katie Spriggs here, and then we'll also have some discussion questions from Carolyn that we'll throw up on the screen and can talk about. We'll also have time after Katie's presentation to do Q&A. So that'll be this session. With that being said, if you have any tech issues or any questions, please go ahead and put those in the chat. I'll be monitoring that as we're going through. And I think without further ado, we'll throw it over to Katie. So Katie, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Jay. So as he said, my name is Katie Spriggs. I am the Executive Director of the Eastern Panhandle Empowerment Center, which is a direct service provider to survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and human trafficking. And we operate in the Eastern Panhandle, so Morgan, Berkeley, and Jefferson, and I'm in Martinsburg right now. That's where my office is. I am, side note, because this is campus, it feels appropriate to mention, I'm a graduate with my bachelor's degree in social work from Shepherd University, and my master's from WVU, also in social work. So it is fun to be among collegiate partners. I also teach as an adjunct at Shepherd. I teach a victim advocacy class, which isn't it so cool that that's a class. And I teach that at Blue Ridge Community College as well, which was the first program in the state to offer it. So that's pretty cool. So intersecting kind of a lot in the work that we do. And then, of course, we work really most closely with the Title IX office at Shepherd, which I'm sure all of you have your own Title IX offices that you're familiar with. And this year, Shepherd's common reading is a book about domestic violence. What you don't know about domestic violence can kill you. So we have been doing tons of work on campus this year. So we've been very connected to the college campus. So my plan for timeline, Jay, if this is fine, is to finish by like 12:40 to allow time for all that other stuff. Do we think that's time enough? Okay. So we will try to wrap up by then. I'm also fine with taking questions throughout, but I will have my screen shared. So if I don't see it in the chat, somebody might have to unmute and say that it's happening. But also fine. My presentation is meant to be interactive. So if you just want to unmute, if not, I will try to pull the chat up on my shared screen, but sometimes we know that doesn't work beautifully. I am also sharing sound. So there is sound in one of these sections of the PowerPoint, and we tested it earlier and it appeared to work, but if for some reason it doesn't work and you can't hear it, let us know. So I am going to go ahead and start. So we're talking about trauma-informed leadership, particularly when providing services to students. So if anyone has never seen the cinematic wonder Schitt's Creek, this is a very small portion of that TV show, and we are watching it for a purpose, just to give everyone the players involved, because they're going to say names that won't make any sense if you've never seen it. The person wearing the palm tree sweater is David, and the person with this backpack around their shoulder is Stevie, and then the only other person in the scene is a robber. So you will see the robber as well. So we're going to watch this, and then there is a reflection question, so pay attention. It's only like a minute and a half.
Good morning. Is there something I could help you with?
Yeah, I'd like you to open your cash register and give me your money.
Okay. Small problem. Our money isn't for sale.
I'm robbing you.
Thought so, yeah.
I'm gonna ask you one more time. Hey, where do you think you're going?
Here. So here's the problem. Our till doesn't currently have any cash in it because my partner is at the bank getting money for the float.
What about you? What do you have?
Wallet full of debt?
Can someone put something in a bag, please?
We only have cloth totes. I hope that's okay.
Whatever.
Would you like some wine?
Okay, yes. Put some booze in a bag.
Do you drink red wine or white wine? Maybe some chilled rosé in the back.
I'll get it.
I'm not letting you go into the back. What else?
Cheese goes good with wine?
Suddenly she's a sales associate. Would you like some cheese?
Yeah, I'll take some cheese.
God forbid he be specific. I guess I'll throw in some brie, some aged cheddar.
That tapenade goes good with the brie.
Tapenade's great, yeah.
Do you have bad skin?
Yeah, sure. Just hurry up.
There you go. Could you help the man with the door? His hands are full.
Sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Why do I feel like we did something wrong?
Okay. So the question of the hour being, what did they do wrong? You can unmute or you can chat because I have figured out that I can also see the chat. So update everyone.
I don't think they did anything wrong.
Yeah, see, if there were candy to be given out as an award for a correct answer, you would win it. So they didn't do anything wrong because they survived. And being robbed is extremely traumatic and unharmed. They survived unharmed. They weren't hurt, physically hurt, and they did a great job keeping each other safe and keeping themselves safe. For anyone who's ever like seen the show, David's boyfriend / business partner comes back and is like, what? And when they're like reflecting on what happened, they do talk about them, somebody, yeah, she's on it. They do talk about them like thinking he had a gun, but then realizing like in real time that he took his hand out of his pocket. So like he probably didn't. So they're processing it like together afterwards and they're realizing things that they didn't realize in the moment because they thought that their lives were in danger. So we're gonna kind of process that theme as we go through. Maybe if we could, okay. How would you each, if asked, how would you define trauma? If you were to just give a definition. Do we sit silently and just start picking out people? That's like the school teacher thing to do, right? Would you define it as one incident? Can one incident be traumatic? Sure. Can repeated incidents be traumatic? What about the first time I ever did this presentation at Shepherd, because I've done it a couple of times now, I was driving to go present and I was on the phone with my mom and she said something about running late for work and like for a reason beyond her traffic or something, and that she was traumatized by having to tell her boss that she was running late. And I was like, oh no, mom, ironically, that's not trauma, that's stress. So we're gonna an incident that negatively affects your life. Sure, yeah. So let's talk about the difference between trauma and stress because we're seeing people kind of use the word trauma interchangeably with stress sometimes. So what's the actual difference? Trauma, an emotional response to a real or perceived harm, real or perceived, and people's perceptions are all different, right? An event, the experience of the event, the effects of the event, trauma is pervasive and life shaping, and it's often unrecognized even by the person who's holding it. It often goes undiagnosed or unnoticed. And stress, as a separate, is like a response to a life event that isn't life shaping or pervasive. It ends, right? Stress ends. Now, can ongoing stress become trauma? Sure, right? If you are put through stress daily, that can often form the same negative effects as trauma on someone's body. Why might two people experience the same traumatic event differently? So if two different people observed or experienced the same event at the same time, why might they perceive that differently? Why might they describe it differently or talk about it differently or be affected by it differently? What do you think? Did they grow up in different life circumstances? Probably. Do they have a different culture or identity? Maybe. Have they had previous traumas that differ? Maybe. Right? So all of these things influence how someone receives and experiences and survives trauma. All of these things that go to build a person. Life challenge. Okay, so now if we're going to talk about where does trauma live in their brain, we're looking at your prefrontal cortex, which is part of your brain circuitry. So your brain obviously does lots and lots of things, right? What an understatement. But one of the part of the brain that we're going to focus on today mostly is the fear circuitry. So that's the part of your brain that is all connected to produce the feeling and the response to fear. And it pretty much runs like a smartphone. So your smartphone does some things without your consent. it's pre-programmed. So maybe you have your phone programmed to automatically update while you're sleeping. So while your phone's on the charger at night while you're sleeping, it automatically updates. You wake up in the morning and it's like, oh, you need your PIN to unlock your phone because it updated while you were sleeping. Those updates feed into things that you don't even fully understand. Who here reads the entire 47,000 page update they send you that tells you exactly what they're doing to your phone when you update it? Who's ever read that? Nobody. I don't even think whoever wrote it read it. Like, was this just an AI? Who wrote this? Like, I don't think that they even read it. So no one reads it. We don't really even fully understand what it does, but it does it. It does it without us telling it to. And then there are other things that your phone does when you tell it to. For instance, you tell it to call someone. You click on their name, you hit the little phone button, and it calls them. You're telling it to do that. So think of your brain in that same sort of system where it does some things without your permission. It just does it. You have no like audible or intentional control over it. And then there's other things that you tell your brain to do. For example, one thing that your brain does that you don't tell it to do is you do not, most people do not constantly feel their clothing on their body. So when you put a pair of pants on, you're not like, oh, my skin can feel those pants. Like every second of every day. You forget you're wearing clothes, right? They don't bother you throughout the day unless they're really uncomfortable. You're not conscious of it because your brain has evolved to remember that you're going to wear clothes. Humans wear clothes, and this is how they feel in your body, and we don't have to worry about that because that's a normal feeling. Other times, commands prompt certain actions, and you tell your brain to worry it to think about something. For instance, if you're trying to solve a math problem, you might be asking your brain to remember your multiplication table. It doesn't just always produce that. Sometimes it does. You're like 9 times 9. Oh, wow. My brain just knows that. Sometimes you have to really think about it or do long math, right? So think about the brain's response to trauma in both of those categories. What do we control and what do we not control? And do different people have different levels of control? Spoiler alert, yes, they do. Everybody has a different level of control. So your fear circuitry is really housed in your amygdala. That's that tiny part of your brain that's like right behind your eye. And it is the powerhouse of the brain. Even though it's so tiny, it is what senses danger. So it receives messages from your senses, touch, smell, taste, all of it, sound. It absorbs those and it's like, oh no, that thing could cause us harm. We should worry about that, right? We should be mindful of that. Now, think of it as a smoke detector. So your amygdala is like, I got to sound off when something's happening. Oh, by the way, not necessarily a fun fact, but a fact nonetheless, this is where triggers lay in the brain. So if you've ever heard someone talk about being triggered, that forms and is created in their amygdala. Because it's essentially your amygdala saying, remember the last time that you smelled that or tasted that or saw that or felt this way. This is what happened. Your life was, you were harmed. So we better like freak out and prevent ourselves from being put in that situation again. So imagine somebody is assaulted by a person wearing a yellow shirt and they're walking down the street a couple of years later and they pass someone wearing a similar yellow shirt and their body starts to react to it. They might start sweating. Their breathing might increase. They might feel scared or alarmed or unsettled, and they have no control over it because their amygdala was like, hey, remember the last time that somebody was wearing that shirt? Remember what happened? We should probably panic, right? And it tells their brain, like, you need to react. You need to protect yourself, even though there is no active danger. That's a trigger. That's where it's from. So let's say that our amygdala is our smoke detector, and we introduce the concept of repeated ongoing trauma. So some of the students you might work with have had repeated ongoing trauma. That requires your smoke detector or their smoke detector to overwork. Because normally, smoke detector goes off, amygdala is like, hey, 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 danger, danger, danger. The threat is mitigated, and the body returns to normal function. But what if the threat is never mitigated? Or it wasn't mitigated for a very long time? So think you're working with someone who experienced child sexual or child physical abuse. Their amygdala would call out for help or tell their body to respond. No matter what response they gave, it didn't prevent the violence. So it's happened. Their amygdala has tried and failed all these times to protect itself. What do you think that does to someone's brain? When they're like, you should stop this from happening, but it still happens. Good question. No one has an answer because we don't know. Everybody's response is going to be different. So one person who maybe had repeated ongoing trauma, their smoke detector overworks. So their amygdala is like, hey, you should panic, you should panic, you should panic. Something's going to happen. Like be constantly on alert. Other people's smoke detector might underwork. So these are the people that there's like an active crisis happening around them. And they're like, meh, I've seen worse, because they have, right? Like their smoke detector's like, meh, we've survived. We've survived worse. Don't freak out. It's okay. So I really say all that. That's not like incredibly helpful, I know, because it's like, well, that doesn't help me work with this person, because I don't know how they're going to react. But that's just it. That's the whole point, is you're going to be working with traumatized people who they themselves could not predict what their brain is going to do. So it would be impossible for you as a person who's helping them to predict it, but you can help normalize it. So if they're saying, I constantly feel scared, I constantly feel overwhelmed, you could say, that's your brain's way of protecting itself. Let's talk through that. Let's talk about ways that we could help mitigate that. Has anyone ever read the book, The Body Keeps the Score? Oh my God, genius. This human should like be framed. We should frame the human who wrote it, and they should get all of the awards in the world, because it is a very well-written book that really talks deeply about how your body and your brain keeps the score, hence the name, of what happens to you through a lifetime and how that can come out later in life. And my favorite part of what he does really well in the book is he talks about why some people who have experienced ongoing trauma might be resistant or seem resistant to helpers providing services. So why might they not show up to their counseling appointment? Why might they, every time you offer support, say, well, that's not going to work anyway? Why might they be negative? Why might, like, all those things, right? He really does a good job of explaining that. And I just thought that he does a really good job of summarizing the issues here. When the system breaks down, we become like conditioned animals. The moment we detect danger, we automatically go into fight or flight mode, which I think that we've heard, right? Like the world has heard that. We've heard this fight or flight mode. But when you actually think about what does that mean in real life with real practice with real people, that book does a really good job of explaining it. So if anyone is looking for a good read, I would suggest it. Amygdala is the powerhouse. We talked about that. Your fear circuitry is always on. Every person's is. Right now, it is monitoring your environment for things that could cause you harm, even unexpected things. So your brain's like, look. Let's watch around. Let's see around. Oh, also, fun fact, what part of your brain do you think is affected by substances? Your fear circuitry. Good question. Your amygdala and your prefrontal cortex. So this part of your brain right here behind your forehead is affected when you use a substance, alcohol, marijuana, prescription medication, all of that affects your prefrontal cortex, which we're going to talk about what that does in a second. So again, we talked about that it could bring up triggers. So there's your prefrontal cortex. It is the slowest developing part of the brain, and it is not fully developed in most adults until what age? Has anyone ever heard this? What's the age? Because you all work with people who are under the age. So God bless your souls.
Roughly 25.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, roughly 25, depending on the person. This is also the part of the brain. Has anyone ever heard of the term like trauma brain or like generational trauma brain? So that's the idea that traumatic events can actually shape the brain differently. So not necessarily like, I don't like to say misshapen, because everyone has a different shaped brain, but it can impact the shape and the function of the brain. Childhood trauma, experiencing childhood trauma while your brain is still developing. So when we say childhood, we mean like under 26. So people can have a differently shaped brain because of the trauma they've experienced. And then here's the scary part, they can genetically pass that differently shaped brain for what scientists have proven up to 4 generations. So a traumatized brain can be passed through either parent to the child that they're genetically contributing to. So this is that part of the brain. When people are talking about that, like what part of the brain does trauma affect the most, including shaping it, the prefrontal cortex. That's what we're looking at. So let's talk about all the things that it does. It's extremely complex part of the brain, and it develops slowly. We talked about that. It helps you to focus attention where you want it. So think about people who would have a misshapen prefrontal cortex. Think about the deficits that they're walking into just by being born with a traumatized brain. Helps them to focus their attention in a way they want. So this could affect being able to focus, right? It helps us stay on our task and goals and stay moving forward. And it is extremely important in focusing attention. So like, I want to give my attention to this thing. That's the part of the brain that allows you to do that intentionally. So imagine if someone is impaired in that area, how this could affect their daily life and the way that they receive services. It helps you to not only understand what is happening, but why it might be happening to you. Like, why might someone do this thing, or why might this happen? It helps you reason. And here's the most important part, it inhibits our impulses. So it helps us to not do the thing, right? This is the thing in the back of your mind that when you're driving and somebody cuts you off, you are just like, well, that was annoying, instead of freaking out and, like, tailgating them and honking. And it's the part of your brain that prevents you from doing that, because it's not going to be helpful, right, to the big situation at hand. Now, again, imagine someone in two ways. Right after trauma, because what happens during a traumatic event, your amygdala is like, hey, 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 we have a problem. Your then older part of your brain, the back part of your brain, releases chemicals that flood your prefrontal cortex. Chemicals is vague, right? Which chemical? Who knows? Because it depends on the situation, it depends on the person. Some people, it might be adrenaline. So these are the people who, if you interact with them immediately following a traumatic event, they're like shaking. They're like hype. They're like, oh, like I don't know. I don't know what happened. They're kind of like talking a mile a minute, and they really can't describe it. And they're like quick. That it might produce dopamine, and the person might be sleeping immediately following an event. So one of the things that our advocates do, that all sexual assault advocates do across the state, is they respond to hospital calls for people who are getting a sexual assault exam. So this is within 96 hours by default. It has to be. So exams are only done if a sexual assault occurred within 96 hours. So our advocate is going, face to face with people within hours of an assault. And we have seen all kinds of responses, all kinds of really quick responses. People sleeping, people sort of just like dazed. They have no concept of time or what's happening to them or where they are in the moment. People whose adrenaline is up and they're like shaking in the bed, vibrating with energy. And again, that how your brain responds, it's an evolutionary response that's based on your experiences, the generations before you experiences, the culture in which you live, like the position in which you hold in society. All of that shapes how our brain responds. We have no control over it. And that can be really hard for trauma survivors to like really work through. Like, I couldn't have done anything differently because my brain took over, and this is just what it does. So think of it in real life, like immediately following an event, this is what our brain's doing. But then think about this for the long-term effects of trauma. So if trauma shapes our prefrontal cortex in childhood and adulthood, affects the functioning of our prefrontal cortex, how do then long-term trauma survivors move through life after that? So they might have difficulty with reasoning. They might have difficulty with being impulsive. They might have difficulty maintaining a case plan because they have difficulty staying on task and goal. So think about the like long-term effects of this in both settings, like immediately following trauma, but then also long-term effects. We just talked about that. So the amygdala reacts, the fear circuitry receives the threat. How do you think that this could affect victims' real-time response to trauma? So traumatic event happened. Amygdala is like, oh no. Brain releases chemicals. The prefrontal cortex is now flooded with chemicals, so it is not functioning. Their ability to reason, inhibit impulses, all of that gone. How might that affect someone's real-time response? What might they do or not do? So for example, one of the things I do pretty often is I testify in criminal hearings, usually on the side of the prosecutor, to talk about why a victim might do something, whatever the thing might be. And I was testifying in a sexual assault hearing a couple of years ago, and the one sticking point that no one could move past in this trial was that during this sexual assault, the victim's good friend was in the adjoining bathroom. So this happened in a bedroom. There was an adjoining bathroom, and she was in there asleep in the bathroom. So everybody brought up, well, why didn't she just go wake up her friend? Like, the door was right there, is in the same room. So that's a perfect example of your prefrontal cortex is working, like ours is working. So when we're hearing this, we're like, oh my God, like help is right through the door. She could have just gotten up and run through the door, but her prefrontal cortex wasn't working, right, in real time when this was happening. They may act without thought. Yeah. and they will act with how their fear circuitry is telling them is going to help them survive. So it might be to freeze. If you've ever talked to a trauma survivor that says, like, during the event, I couldn't move. Like, I actually couldn't move. I don't know what was going on. I couldn't move my muscles. That's actual, like, freeze, a genetic evolutionary response to trauma, freeze. Some people might flee, but that doesn't often look like how we think it looks. So fleeing might mean trying to talk your way out of it. Like, oh, I have to go. Like, it's not usually actively running. That's not usually a trauma response. Some people, sure, but this makes it difficult that there's not just an easy answer. This is what people do, right? It's really hard to work in the middle and in the gray area to help people understand that. Repeated trauma can shift the baseline operation of a prefrontal cortex, and it helps us empathize. Have you ever worked with traumatized people who have a really hard time with empathy? That's why. You should work in a shelter. Boy, oh boy. So we have like 16 traumatized people all under one roof. And the lack of empathy is sometimes frightening. But it makes sense, right? Like, we completely understand it. It's just, how do you make this work, right? With all of these people under one roof. Okay, so this is an activity. I'm gonna stop. All right, doing this virtually is not as easy as doing it in person. So here's what I want you to do. I'm going to give you a scenario. If you yourself, you're living as yourself, would respond with logic, meaning you take a second, you really think through your response, and then you respond. You're going to stay standing. So essentially, like, imagine that you're all standing up. When you sit down, you're going to put in the chat, I'm sitting down. I sat down. If you would respond with impulse, you're going to sit down. So everyone's imaginarily standing. You can stand if you really want. Like, if you're at your desk and you're like, standing sounds like a good idea. Stand up. But you're figuratively standing. When you sit down, you're going to put in the chat, I sat down. So we know who's still standing and who's sitting. Does that make sense? Again, a lot easier in person, but we're making it work. Okay, so here's the scenario. You are going to the airport. Some people sit down. They're like, no, I'm not. I'm not going to the airport. So they're like, I'm not flying. So it looks like all of you have made it to the airport. My mom is like almost 60 and has never flown in an airplane in her life, and probably never will. So she would be sitting down. So you're going to the airport and you are flying by yourself for a personal flight. Like, this is for fun. This isn't for work. Okay, everyone's still hanging in there. So you arrive at the airport and you check your bag and you go through security. It's going well. You get to your boarding gate and you're like 2 hours early, as we all are. And you wait your turn. And then when it's time to board the plane and you have your boarding pass and you scan it, it does the and they're like, oh, unfortunately, you've been bumped from this flight. All right. Doing well. All right. Everyone's still, people go home at this point sometimes, by the way. Like, nope, I got bumped. I'm leaving. So you are like, that's fine. I'll wait. I'll talk to the, airline, whatever. So everyone else boards, you talk to the airline and they say, the next flight that we can get you on is in 12 hours. And unfortunately, it's our airline's policy that we don't do hotel rooms. Okay, everyone's still standing. I gotta say, at this point, I think I would just go home and come back. But what, we live kind of far from an airport, so maybe other people are like, I'm not doing that. So you wait your 12 hours in the very comfortable airport chairs, and you eat, a $400 airport meal, and you get your new boarding pass, and it's 12 hours later, and you go to board, and oh, we actually couldn't get you on this flight. Doing okay? Everyone doing all right? Okay. No, sitting. Yeah. I'd go home, to be honest. Like, at that, I'd be like, it's sorry, next year. Okay, so for those of you who are still standing, you wait for everyone else to board, and they're like, okay, so the next flight we can get you on is in 10 hours. Yeah, sitting down and also angry. Yeah. Okay, so for those very patient people in the room, you wait now 10 more hours. So we're at a total of 22 hours. You have your new boarding pass and you go to scan it. What is everyone expecting at this point? Is the boarding pass going to work? Nope, nobody's expecting it to work. Well, guess what? It works. So you scan 22 hours later, you scan your and you get on the flight. You're like, yes, finally, a day later. So you get on your flight, you fly to your destination, you get off your flight. You go to baggage claim. What do you think is missing? Your bag does not come out the claim. It doesn't come out. Everyone's melting down. So, for those of you who are still standing, you walk over to the baggage claim people behind their little DMV window and you tell my bag didn't come. And they're like, okay, hold on, let us look for it, whatever. So you sit down for an hour at this point out of precedent and you wait on your bag. Let's say that you made the rookie mistake and you put something in your bag that you desperately need. So you're waiting. Hour and a half later, here they come. Has anyone ever been to the airport and you've seen the bags come out that are like saran wrapped because they've disintegrated? Okay, so that's your bag. So here they bring your bag and it's disintegrated and it is saran wrapped. And you open it to find that some of your items are missing. Wow, we have some. I can't tell actually at this point if everyone has sat down, but if you are still standing, you are a very patient person and we should all learn from you. So you take your disintegrated bag back up to the airline people and you're like, hey, like stuff is missing, something happens. And they say, oh, we don't know how to help you. And they close the gate. Like, you know, the talking gate where they close it. So you can't talk to them anymore. How are we feeling? Okay, so for all of you who are still survived, you look around the room, everyone, that's who you should fly with. Look around your little Zoom space if you can tell. That pick them for your next flight. Now, for everybody, sitting or standing, tell me how you're feeling at this point. If this just happened to you and you get in your friend's car at the airport, what are you feeling? Frustrated, exhausted. What would be really helpful for your friend to say to you when you got in their car? How about, oh my God, that sucks, right? Like, geez, I can't believe that happened. Let's go get a burger. Yeah, I know where the closest bar is, right? Like, man, oh, that, I can't believe that's crazy. Like, I can't believe that happened to you. All right, now, flip side. What would be completely unhelpful for your friend to say? How about, that wasn't so bad. I've been through worse. It could have been, I think if that, I think I just get out of the moving car at that point. Um, it'll be okay. Or how about my favorite? That's what you get for flying Spirit Airlines. Everyone knows not to fly Spirit. How about, oh, don't forget you have to fly back in a couple days. Or, oh, this might be the end for me. How about, well, you should have complained. You should have done something different. You, the victim of this whole mess, should have done something differently, and this wouldn't have happened. Yeah, even if maybe that was true, like even if there was something else you could have done differently. At this point, you just got in the car, 25,000 hours later, that is not what you want to hear, right? So I ask you, as helping people who are going to work with traumatized people, to keep that feeling in mind, the feeling of getting in your friend's car. That's how you should approach that. So whenever somebody comes into your office and they're obviously maybe not making the best decisions and they're not in a good spot and they're in whatever way they might be asking for help, keep in mind the lens of how you wanted to get into the car, how you wanted people to treat you. Even if it feels like, oh, well, like you could have done this thing differently. Maybe not the time, right? Not the time to point that out, or not the way to point that out. I can't tell if you said it'll be okay would be helpful to hear or unhelpful to hear, because I feel like maybe both, depending on the time in our lives. Okay, so speaking of asking for help, we're gonna go from there. All right, we kind of talked about that. In an effort to shut off terrifying sensations, they also deaden their capacity to feel fully alive. It'll be okay is unhelpful. Yeah, I agree. What's the big deal? You made it, right? I'd be like, I barely made it. We barely are here. Okay, so what about this philosophy of asking for help? Our brain has trained us from birth to call out or make a facial expression when we need something. What does that sound like in an infant? Crying, right? Like that's what they do. And then we foster that through life. So you throw a ball to your teammate in basketball, they shoot, make the basket, and you win. And your brain is like, oh my gosh, look at this cool thing I contributed to. I contributed to that person contributed to the team, and the team won. What do you think happens to the brain when someone calls out or non-verbally asks for help and doesn't get it? And what if that happens every day? What might that result in? What would people do? Stop asking for help? Or if help is offered, stop believing that it could work? Resistant to help? Not really even understanding what help is, right? Not ask. Yeah. So keep that in mind too. Like the people that you're working with that might be really, really hard to help, they might be really, really hard to help because no one's ever helped them and they've tried, right? How do you, personally, you ask for help when you need it? And have you ever thought about that before now? We don't talk about this, right? Like as a society, we don't talk about this with kids. We don't talk about this with adults. We often don't even talk about this in our relationships, in our personal relationships, which is something we probably should talk about, right? Like, how do I ask for help? Is anybody my favorite type of human where when you need help, you're just like passive aggressive? So you go home and the trash is piled up and nobody did it, and you're like, oh, it would be helpful if someone did the trash. So instead, you loudly take the trash out. Like every sound you can possibly make, you make it, right? Mm-hmm. What about flip side? How do you receive help? So when you do ask for it and you receive it, are you then forever indebted to that person and you feel forever indebted? Do you just say thank you and keep it moving? Do you then feel like you have to reciprocate? Yeah. As social workers, it can be difficult to ask for help because we're so used to being a helper. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then when you ask for help, do you feel guilty? And this is really just to get you thinking about how the people that you interact with ask for help and ways that they receive help that might feel ungrateful in the moment, but could just be a response to their life and their traumas and their experience. So we're shifting the focus from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. That's essentially the whole philosophy, and you probably all know that. And then we're going to go through this, and then we do have time for questions. So to really have a trauma informed practice, it's more than just saying like trauma happens to people and I understand it, right? It's like trauma happens to people, and how trauma happens to people shapes the way that we respond to each individual person. The people that you're working with should feel like their safety is your number one priority, even if maybe they're not asking for it to be. Like deep down, they should know like your safety and your well-being is my number one priority. If you have to make a decision about their case, it's made with transparency. So this like idea that there are times when even if you have to call CPS or APS, you can tell them that you're doing that, right? Like how do we build that kind of relationship? We understand that people don't heal linearly, so they don't heal in a silo. Often people heal surrounded by a community of peers. So how do we integrate that? How do we help people not feel isolated? If there is a power difference in your organizational structure or in the way that you respond to help requests for help, that's addressed and acknowledged. So let's say, for instance, here, like at the shelter, there is not any one person that could say someone can't come into the shelter. So if client A needed shelter and my advocate said they needed it, I couldn't then be like, no, even though I'm the director of the program. So like decisions aren't made single-handedly. We recognize strengths of people and we build on those, even the strengths you don't like. So like, have you ever met someone that you're like, man, that's a skill, but it is a hard to work with skill. So like the people who maybe they know, let's say they needed diapers for their kid and their kid could not possibly use all of the diapers that they got, but they got all these diapers from like 87 different organizations that give out diapers. And you're like, wow, like you could spread some of those resources out to other people, but also what a strength that you knew how to find all those diapers and you got all of them. Like that is a strength. And it might be one that makes us uncomfortable or is difficult to work with, but it is a strength, right? So like, let's build on that. And we evaluate our bias implicitly and explicitly and openly with each other. We're gonna, oh, this, I just put this in here to note, it's a really interesting component to the work that we do. So in domestic violence shelters across the nation, historically, there were lots and lots and lots of rules, kind of crazy rules, like you can only stay for 2 weeks. The curfew is 7 p.m. It's like things that just don't make any sense, and they make it a barrier to stability, but yet they're implemented. So Missouri did created this entire research project to reduce rules in domestic violence shelters to see if it worked. Mississippi, sorry, to see if it worked. Like, what happens if we get rid of all these kind of crazy rules? Here's what they did. They reduced the rules, and here's what they found. Residents moved into independent, safe living 50% more often with less rules. Substance use decreased 38% in 2 years. Residents spoke more highly of case management and were likely to engage in it when they weren't forced to participate. Chores were evenly and equitably distributed by choice. They chose their own chores and they did them. And they reported feeling safer with less rules. So this tells us that if we make our services more accessible and less like guideline oriented, we have more success, right? And that can portray across all service providers. So what do we look at? What do we look at from here within ourselves? Are we tailoring our approach to the differing needs of our people that we serve? Are we assessing for culturally specific needs each time? Do we ask people? Culture, like Appalachia is a culture. People who heal inside of Appalachia and identify as Appalachian might have different healing strategies than someone who doesn't, right? So are we assessing for all of these kind of responsive ways to heal? Are we flexible in our approach? What do we do when someone misses an appointment and doesn't follow up? Are they just kicked out of services? Is there a more flexible way to do it? Is there a way to make sure people know that if that does have to be the rule? How do we internally discuss our complicated cases? So if we're talking to our coworker, how are we talking about this complicated person? Because talking about them negatively would affect the way that we serve them. It's an implicit bias, right? And are we banning people from services or jobs based on however their response has been? Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing, and then I don't know what order you want to do it in, if you want them to ask me questions or if you want to have the pose questions, whatever, the preference of the group.
No, thank you, Katie. We really appreciate it. We'll open it up to the group first. So feel free to put it in the chat or unmute.
Obviously, one thing in many of our student populations is I think that was a wonderful overall presentation on trauma, and our BIPOC students and LGBTQ students also. Yeah, there just some awareness around what they're facing.
It's really hard to do the work that we all do in a state where often the legislators or the people who are in charge make decisions that harm people that we're working with. And it feels very hard to, like, I feel that deeply. Like, how do we even like continue to move forward and encourage these people when part of us is like, maybe you should just move out of the state, right? Like, how, like, I think that is important. How do we acknowledge harm on all levels, and then how does that influence their ability to walk through services? I think that's really important. I don't have an answer. I just think it's important that we acknowledge it, like their individualized, like culturally responsive needs, but then also on top of that, the people who can make decisions, and if those decisions harm people, like how are we supposed to manage that?
Any other questions from the group? Alrighty, we can go ahead and Carolyn, I can pull up the questions you submitted, and we can talk about that. Oh wait, Sean, increase or decrease since COVID, coming out of COVID? Any changes there? That was a question he had. Katie, do you have any thoughts on, have you seen anything on that?
Yeah, I think what happened, I mean, COVID was a massive like universal trauma, right? Like we all went through it together. And this is a perfect example of how everyone comes out differently, because some people lost loved ones to it. Some people felt very harmed by people not respecting the health needs of other people. Like I think this is a perfect example of like everyone seeing the same trauma, living through the same trauma, but living through it differently and having different outcomes. Because I think if you ask some people, they're like, oh, whatever, it was weird, I had to stay home for a year, but like whatever. And some are like, no, like I almost died, my family almost died, my family did die. So I think we should expect people to react as if they were traumatized from it, because they were. We all were. And of course, that'll show up differently. So I think we can't discount it. That would be my caution. If you're working with traumatized people who bring up COVID, don't discount it just because we also all lived through it, right? Like it could have disproportionately affected them in a way that it didn't affect you, or they maybe already had medical sensitivity and this is already something they were really scared of, and then it happened and millions of people died and they watched it. And so I would say, remember that it was a trauma experience and that we all went through it together, and you're going to have, like, we're all going to have biases because we lived through it too. So make sure to kind of mitigate your own thoughts and biases around it when working with people, and see it for what it was. I mean, it killed millions of people and we all watched it. So remember that that's traumatizing and treat it as such. And it definitely changed the way that we like shelter. Oh, I have a few clients who do not like the word trauma being used in sessions. I would call it harm, hurt, pain. I guess ask them maybe, what do you think of that as? And you're right, it does definitely hold a stigma in Appalachia. Like you should just be able to pull your boots, tie your shoes, and what's the phrase? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I don't even really know that phrase. I hate it and I don't know it. So that's sort of the like culture though in Appalachia. So around pain. So I would call it harm, or whatever they seem less sensitive to. Yeah, it's like a term everyone uses, where really it's like a diagnosis, but just like depression, people use that a lot when they don't actually mean clinical depression. They just mean being sad or melancholy. Yeah. PTSD, people use that all the time when like we know that not everyone actually has PTSD. So yeah, good point.
Right, let me share my screen here. Thank you for those questions and comments. Give me 1 second, Carolyn. This up.
Katie, thank you so much for that discussion and all of your definitions. Just good reminders on some things and good new information as well. Just keep kind of top of mind for everybody working on the campuses. So thank you. I had some questions. As some of you know, I've been visiting a lot of the campuses over this year to have discussions about mental health and what the needs are on the campuses. And I've had several people bring up kind of what services for athletes look like, and how different schools are negotiating those things. And so I know we just have about 8 or 9 minutes here, but I wanted to throw out to the group just a couple of these questions that I've been hearing from the campuses, and see if you all have any interest in discussing this for the next few minutes. So some schools have been conducting mental health screenings with their student athletes, and some are even integrating that into their annual physical for their athletes. And then other schools have all their athletes that meet with a counselor at the beginning of their season. And I've also heard from schools that they're afraid to start screening athletes because this can lead to such an increase in their volume, and they're already at capacity in their centers. So I just have a few questions here around, is it better? How are you all handling mental health of athletes on your campuses? Is it, just kind of along in with the regular population of students? Are there any specific mental health concerns you're seeing? Are you all seeing an uptick in athletes that you're seeing in your centers? Or if you're not, some on the call are not in counseling centers or just working on campus, are you seeing more needs among your athletes? So just wanted to throw out a few of those questions. You can take any question you heard there and run with it. We also might have a handful on the call who don't know what campus other people are on. So if you don't have anything to say right off, you might just put in the chat which school you're from.
Carolyn, I'll start. Shauna from West Virginia Wesleyan College. I am the sole, sorry, sick. The sole therapist employed on Wesleyan's side. And then students also have the option of seeing two part-time counselors through community care. Because we are short on campus people, we'll often do large group education with, like in December, with the whole athletic department, coaches, assistant coaches, athletic trainers, and so forth, brought them together and showed them a 17-minute documentary called It's Real: Mental Health on College Campuses. It's a documentary put out by American Federation for Suicide Prevention. Anyway, what we watched that video, we had open dialogue about how to get students to the counseling center if needed, ways that they can support students that may not be in immediate crisis, but just for them to have the awareness of what we're discussing. And then Wesleyan just got to participate in the NCAA's Apple Institute out of UVA Charlottesville, and they have a wealth of quality resources for our student athletes with substance use disorder and or other mental wellness conditions. So we're making progress in the way that with limited resources, do have a good bit of student athletes that come in for sessions because 50 to 60% of our population are student athletes.
Shauna, thanks for sharing that. That's actually a lot that you've done within this year to address it. I haven't heard of the Apple Institute. Did you say it's through the NCAA? It's one of their efforts?
It is. It's been around since 1991. I had just heard of it when we were selected to participate. And so we took myself, Jackie Hinton, who's our director of athletic compliance, Teresa Black, one of our nursing professors, and you can take up to 3 student athletes, and we took 2 because the whole point is that much of this is peer-based education.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, schools get selected to go and then can opt in for future trainings. It was one of the best trainings that I've been to regarding student athletes.
That's great. I'll have to look into that and see. Was there an application process that you all went through before you got selected?
I think the NCAA itself decides, but Carolyn, I can get you info on that and when I talk with Jackie to see how the process started. Sorry, my throat's going out.
Fine. It's fine. Thanks for sharing. Does anybody else? We have just a couple minutes left. Does anybody else have any thoughts on what you're doing around athlete mental health? Jessica, I see in the chat, yes, I will share, either Jay or I will share that information once we get it. Right. Well, if there are no other thoughts, I did want to encourage you, if you're here for CEUs, just make sure you drop what discipline you are. We have to include if you're a social worker or a counselor, et cetera, what credential you're trying to get the CEU for on the form. And sometimes I have to go back and contact you after. So if you're here for CEUs, just make sure you drop in the chat what your discipline is. And I'll turn it over to you, Jay. Thanks.
Thanks, Carolyn. And thanks again, Katie, for the presentation. We really appreciate it. The slides will be uploaded to the I ecosystem, so everybody will have access to them. You also get a recap email with the links to the video recording, also the session evaluation. So we really appreciate any feedback you can provide on the session. And then if we have the Apple information, the Apple Institute information, we'll send that in the recap. If not, we'll send out a separate email to everybody so they make sure they get it. So no worries. If you don't see it in the recap email, you will get it shortly thereafter. So if there aren't anything else, thank you for putting your information in the chat like Carolyn requested. We'll make note of that, and we'll see you in April. All right. Take care.